Welcome, everyone. I will get us started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Tommy Mayberry. My pronouns are he, she, and they. So any of those three series, when used with respect, are how you can refer to me. And I am the director of our Center for Teaching Excellence and Innovation here at Yorkville University and Toronto Film School. And it is my incredible honor to be welcoming our guest, Dr. Lisa Endersby, here today for her talk on experiential learning and reflective practice, from what happened to what matters. Before I pass it over to Lisa to get us started, I do want to offer a bit of a large institutional land acknowledgement because at Yorkville University and Toronto Film School, as we know, we work across multiple lands governed by multiple treaties and agreements with this nation now called Canada. As we proudly say of ourselves, we work coast to coast, from the coast out in what is now known as New Brunswick to the west coast out in what is now known as British Columbia. And we draw resources in all of our work from numerous traditional territories from these diverse Indigenous nations and the people who are still here today. So our campus in what is now known as New Brunswick sits on land under the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1760 and 1761, which is the land of the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Mi'kmaq, and the Wolastoqiyik First Nations. Our campuses in what is now known as downtown Toronto, as well as the Steeles neighborhood in Toronto, sit on the treaty land of the Toronto Purchase of 1787, which is also known as Treaty 13, and is the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And our campus in what is now known as British Columbia is not actually treaty land, but sits on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, and Kakite First Nations. So being unceded and not having ever entered into signing treaty agreements with the government of Canada, I think that feels similar to the broken and undelivered promises of treaties. I've seen and I've learned from Indigenous leaders and from settler allied peers that we can and should start referring to most lands as unceded because of the way that the colonizing language of English and the broken laws were not upheld, were not honored, and effectively then should be null in the way that unceded territories also have existed as not having entered into those. So it's important for me as I keep learning, unlearning, and relearning about the lands across which we work and engaging with the folks local to where our campuses and head offices are physically built, to think about the language that the official, in air quotes for that, the official territorial acknowledgements of only one of our provinces notes unceded because the others say treaty and therefore engages in as if the treaties were built in a good way, for those as well. And this is important for us when we think about our scholarly teaching work from coast to coast, as we say, because all of us need to commit to not just learning and unlearning, but to relearning about treaties, about histories, about people on all of the lands across which we operate. And I think that that's a really important way that we can think really powerfully about reconciliation, not as the goal, but as part of the movement of moving in truth and toward reconciliation as we continue working in a good way. So thank you again. And Dr. Lisa, thank you for joining us. I am going to mute and pass it over to you to keep us going in a good way today.
Thanks so much, Tommy. Hello, everyone. As I was joking before, knowing that folks may be joining from multiple provinces, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's so good to see everyone. And thank you, Tommy, as you mentioned, for starting us in a good way. For me, and I'll move to the next slide in just a minute, but revisiting, reflecting on, thinking about land acknowledgements is work that I will admit has only really recently come into part of my reflective and scholarly practice. The way that I tend to work and the way that I tend to, I guess, think and organize a lot of my thoughts can be very much bullet points. Some of you on the call know how type A I joke about, but really am. And I know that for this type of work, it is really a process. It's a lot of those ing verbs. It's a lot of becoming, as you said, Tommy, learning and unlearning. And it's in that spirit that I hope to lead this session today around experiential learning and reflective practice, and also to lead the work we do around the land acknowledgements. So thank you again for inviting me here today. The work that I've done on experiential learning and reflective practice comes primarily from almost 9 years that I spent at York University as an educational developer. I spent a lot of time there working with individual faculty colleagues, faculties, units, departments, places, people, as one of the folks to guide a lot of these conversations on experiential learning and reflective practice. So while I have that York context, my goal today is obviously to broaden that discussion to think about some of these ideas in the practicality and also in ways that you might be able to apply them in your own work. I'll also mention as well, I was commenting on a few folks who have such lovely and interesting, visually interesting backgrounds on their Zoom calls today. And as you can see, I'm starting from a primarily blank slate. That's because this is the beginning of week 2 for me in a new role. I'm currently the integrated service excellence and curriculum lead. Yep, I think that's right. Here at Humber College, where I am spending a lot of time thinking about curriculum, but from a framework that informs the work we do in an area of student services that supports accessible learning, health, and a lot of our counseling services as well. So it's applying a curricular learning centered framework to a lot of the services that we provide our students, which is its own drink through a fire hose, but a really exciting opportunity that does incorporate and will slowly begin to incorporate a lot of our work in experiential learning and reflective practice. So all that being said, I've got a lot on my mind. So you may hear a few of those things slip in, but I do hope to focus our discussion today on giving you a little bit of grounding in how I approach experiential learning and reflective practice before we move into some discussion together today. I'm going to do my best to be mindful of the time and wrap up in about an hour or so. Tommy, I'll need you to make sure that I'm not going beyond that because I can and I will, especially on topics like this. I'll also let you know you'll be receiving a copy of these slides after the session today, as well as my contact information and any additional information that may prove useful. So please do reach out if you have any questions. And speaking of questions, I do have the chat window open as well. So at any point, if you have questions, I usually keep an eye on the chat while I'm chatting. So if you have questions for me, you can certainly send me a private message or share it with everyone. And that can include, Lisa, you were speaking too fast. Can you go back? Or I have a question about X. I do have some dedicated time at the end for some question and discussion, but I'm also open and very flexible to taking questions as they come, if there is something that you'd like to discuss a little bit further. I think that's enough preamble, eh, Tommy? Let's go into the main portion of our session today. So make sure that this is up and running. There we go. So as Tommy was mentioning, and as you saw me reflect on, the work of a land acknowledgement and engaging with the history of the land, the current climate, where I sit and my relationship to the land, particularly being a settler, is something that I have spent a long time reflecting on. Certainly don't have any answers, still have a lot of questions, but I do find that the act and art of reflection has been useful for me in working through these conversations in a good way. I was saying to Tommy earlier, being very new to Humber, I was contemplating offering a land acknowledgement this morning from Humber College, but recognize that it would be quite a rote and inauthentic land acknowledgement. And I would be reading it, likely mispronouncing some very important terms and words, and not really coming from a place of understanding. So instead, I wanted to offer you that my thought process, if you will, the way that I've been reflecting on land acknowledgements is this movement from awareness, so knowing that there are land acknowledgements and recognizing that more and more in higher education, we are called upon to consider, if not to offer land acknowledgements. And what does that mean? To acknowledge where we are, where we've come from, where might we be going, and then moving that into action. So that may include thinking about my reflective practice or our work in experiential education from a more Indigenous and not solely Westernized lens. One really good way to think about that for the context of this session today is you may occasionally hear me talk about things like narrative or story or storytelling, and how a lot of experiential learning and reflective practice really grounds us in helping students and others tell the story of their learning or tell the story of an experience that they have been engaged in. However, I'm using terminology like story and storytelling, again, from a very Western, Eurocentric academic lens. And the concept of story and storytelling is actually something I've been digging into a little bit more to consider what that might mean and how that language, like lots of language, may impact my work in reflective practice. So I leave that with you to ponder. I also have the website native-land.ca, great resource that I continue to use to learn a little bit more about the treaties that we work in or work on, the unceded territories. So some of the information that Tommy was referring to in his land acknowledgement, you can find there as well, not just for where you work, but also where you live and other spaces where you may occupy. So, to that end, some of you may be wondering, what's Lisa talking about when she talks about experiential learning? This is a big phrase. This is a big term. There are lots of definitions. There are lots of ways that folks talk about experiential learning. You may also hear language like experiential education in some spaces. You may also hear, as you see on my slide, learning by doing. What I'm going to offer is a little bit of the Lisa definition, but grounded in some literature as well. And again, you're going to have copies of these slides. So any of my citations, I'm also happy to share any of these articles or other resources as well. But what I wanted to do to get us started is trouble a little bit this idea of experiential learning and ground us in ideally sort of a common definition. So, experiential learning, the way that I've entered into a lot of these conversations is I talk about learning from experience, learning by experience, and learning through experience. So, you can see in the way that the wording is constructed, experiential learning, experience, it is very intimately tied to an experience, to something that we are engaged with, something that we are involved with very, not necessarily colloquially, but very commonly, let's say, a lot of folks will talk about experiential learning as learning by doing. This has actually become my entry point into lots of conversations with folks who hope to apply some of these larger concepts into teaching and scholarly practice. Learning, of course, but also through or by doing. So it is in the doing that we're learning, if that sounds vague enough. So let's get a little bit more into what that might look like in practice. A lot of folks have really found value in thinking about experiential learning as this bridge between theory and practice. So, for example, when I was working at York, I worked a lot with colleagues in the Faculty of Health. We had folks in our nursing program who were very practically oriented. Learning by doing is really their mantra for a lot of the work that they did. A lot of their students were on the ground, in clinic, in lab, doing a lot of activities where they had to learn to do something. However, there were classes in the nursing program, as there were in the Faculty of Health more broadly, where there were a lot of theoretical ideas, whether that was, for example, patient-centered care. I worked with folks in global health, for example, so there are certain tenets or ideas around global health. And the idea was we know these things. We can understand them perhaps in a general sense. I have to talk about Bloom's taxonomy at least once a day as a person in higher education. So if we think about that lovely triangle, and for those of you who don't know the horrible joke that I'm making, when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, it's really a way just to use strong action verbs to describe the learning outcomes or goals that we have for student learning. So in this case, using Bloom's taxonomy, they might use language like identify or describe. And those are important learning goals. That's sometimes the theory, right? We understand the theory. What do we do with that? How does that show up in the work that we do? And where is that in the experiences that we're creating or co-creating for our students? What that often looks like, and I'm just moving down the bullet points on sort of the left-hand side of this slide, is that notion of hands-on learning. So you may have heard this term or terminology before, where this is a space where students have the chance to do. And there's anecdotal as well as literature or sort of data-driven evidence that students more and more appreciate, expect, and actually find this type of learning quite highly impactful. So this notion of, yes, I can appreciate that patient-centered care is an important part of my nursing practice. What does that look like? What does that mean? How do I do that? And how do I know, and how do you know that I'm doing that? What does it look like is actually one of my favorite experiential learning questions because it brings to mind this idea of how are we creating an experience where that can happen. So the way that I have often talked this through with colleagues at York and in other spaces is moving from experience to experiential. So the experience might be the class activity that you run. It might be the data collection process that you're engaged with. There are many different experiences that folks will have. How do we articulate and showcase the learning that is happening in those experiences? That's where, for me, we move to experiential. So I'm going to keep making this motion. I use a lot of bridging or transportation metaphors in my work, but it is really for me the bridge from experience. We're going to do something. Ideally, this is an engaging learning experience. How do we know that learning is happening? What does that look like? So we're going to be moving from experience to experiential. The quote that you see sort of left middle on the slide, the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. That's my good friend David Kolb. We've never met, but I imagine we'd be really good friends if we did. Kolb is one of the sort of founding voices in experiential learning. He does have his own cyclical model or process for experiential learning. I won't get into that too much today, but suffice it to say, this language was one of the first times that we were talking about learning from, by, through experience. So I offer that resource. I hesitate to say that 1984 was a long time ago because that's the year I was born, so that feels a little bit confronting. But know that that process and that theory has certainly evolved since then. There are a lot of contextual features that make this really a foundational, maybe not as current, but a foundational way of thinking about experiential learning. So overall, we're transforming an experience that we're having into a meaningful experiential experience, bit of a mouthful, but a way by which we can articulate and showcase student learning. So I'd be remiss to talk about experiential learning without kind of going a little surface level into context. So I've worked in higher education the entirety of my professional career. I've worked in universities, I've worked in colleges, usually in a teaching and learning space, but I've also worked directly with students as well. So context to me becomes really important because it's one thing for me to talk about, this is great and it's really important, without grounding it in a little bit of some of the wider context that we're working in. So this image that you're seeing on the screen, I have the direct link to it underneath. Again, you'll have access if this is of interest. This is from an organization known as CWIL, Cooperative Education and Work Integrated Learning Canada. One thing I really like about what CWIL does, amongst a few different things, is they are really big, like me, into definitions and language, but doing it in context. So a lot of what I was just talking about was experiential learning from a curricular, pedagogical, maybe day to day, in a course, in a classroom, part of your lesson plan approach. What CWIL is also doing is recognizing what experiences are we talking about in experiential learning. Because as you'll see, I'm going to get into reflective practice in a moment, but without a really concrete experience, and concrete experience is one of the terms that David Cole will use to talk about experiential learning. Sewell will talk about where do these experiences come from and offer a lot of guidance around how to structure these experiences to support student learning. So this diagram for me is one way that I can talk about the experience of experiential learning. So in a lot of higher education spaces, you'll probably hear language like co-op, internship, placement, field placement, service learning. Those are different ways of describing an experience where experiential learning can happen. It's also really important to CWIL and to others that we think about these experiences in context because we want to keep students safe. We want to mitigate risk. We have, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but limited time, energy, and resources to do all of these things, both inside and outside of the classroom. So I offer this as a reminder that there are many different ways to talk about the experience of experiential learning. And you'll see here that CWIL sometimes makes a distinction between experiential learning, work integrated learning, co or extracurricular. To me, all that means is where the experience is happening. And I don't oversimplify to understate importance. I just oversimplify to say that there are lots of spaces where this work can happen. But what's nice about experiential learning is the reflective component transcends a lot of these different contexts. So whether you're offering students a service learning opportunity, co-op, if you're engaged in research, which is an experience in and of itself, all of those things flag really important logistical and operational considerations, but reflection is really the glue that brings that all back together. So CWIL is a great resource. I've done a lot of work with CWIL over the past few years. Again, if you're looking for some definitions that are grounded in how the government talks about experiential learning, or where sort of the current discourse is around why students find experiential learning so important. And part of it actually is the skills that they develop, as we well know, employability and otherwise. So CWIL does a good job of pulling that sort of national dialogue together. I'm offering it today to ground us in where those experiences might happen. Could be a co-op, 4-month co-op experience, could also be a SoTL Scholarship of Teaching and Learning project. There are lots of experiences where experiential learning can happen. And Tommy, I just noticed how quick you are with those links in the chat. Thank you so much. So let's get a little bit into reflection and how reflection builds on this notion of learning by doing. So I tend to use the language of reflection as pedagogy to recognize that for me, reflection is a really powerful and valuable teaching tool. It's also a way for our students to develop some really important skills in things that we might call critical thinking. So when I talk about reflection as pedagogy, and I'm going to pass along a couple of resources that speak to a few different models, all of those models, or at least most of them, will talk about reflection as pedagogy in the way that I've put it on the slide. So lots of models of critical reflection will usually describe different ways that a learner can look back. So this is pretty typical when we think about reflection. I make the other really corny joke that, you're going to come to this workshop with me and then you're going to go away and look back on it and think about how great it was. That's reflection, right? Looking back, thinking back to an experience that you had. What reflection as a pedagogy, though, tries to do is move beyond and provide a little bit of structure to what feels like kind of a typical human activity of looking back to also thinking ahead. So you may have noticed, for example, and we'll get there, I've titled my first few slides, What? I've started this slide with So What? So looking back might be the what. What happened? What did that look like? How did I feel? Thinking ahead may start us into the so what. Where do we go from here? What else might I want to do with this experience or the learning from this experience? And most models of critical reflection for a pedagogical approach will talk about making meaningful connections. So I talk with my hands that that's my mother's fault. But how do we pull all of these pieces together into something that feels meaningful? Meaningful is another big sort of amorphous word sometimes, meaning for whom, by whom. But in this case, we can again think about it as looking back, we have data from the experience. We want to think ahead. And the link between looking back and thinking ahead is making meaningful connections between what we know, what happened, and other knowledge or information we might have. So my other best friend is Mary Ryan. I have a quote from her on the bottom left of that screen. Mary Ryan talks about critical reflection, and she says that critical reflection is not an intuitive skill, and competence in different levels of reflection cannot be taken for granted. So, what I like here is not only is reflection something that we are doing with our students as a learning or teaching activity, but it's also a skill that we're teaching our students, knowing that they now will have the ability to look back, to think ahead, and make meaningful connections. So it's a little bit meta, but it's important that it is. We're modeling that in the work that we do with ourselves and others to give folks the chance to develop the skill for doing this kind of work on our own. So before we get into a little bit more reflection and discussion, I wanted to offer a way that we can use reflection to explore evidence-based change. So, primarily when we work in projects related to the scholarship of teaching and learning, and in other spaces as well, we're trying to collect information. We're trying to collect data. We want to know, what does that look like? Is it happening? Is it not happening? Why is that the case? What information do we need to make important, informed decisions? So you might have heard me say earlier in the presentation, this idea of articulating and showcasing information. I will also fully admit that I heard someone say that at a conference and have absolutely co-opted it. So please don't think that that is mine. But it really resonated with me. So I wanted to share it with you too. What I'll add to that for the purposes of the scholarship of teaching and learning is that we're not only articulating learning and showcasing learning, but we also want to document that learning. We want to document that experience. So, reflection ideally allows us to do this work. So, what I've done on this table, on the left-hand side of the table, are the ways that I'm talking about reflection as a practice and a pedagogy. And on the right is the way that I describe what that might look like. So I'm going to move top to bottom as well as left to right when I go through this table. So starting with articulating understanding. For myself as an educational developer, understanding, unfortunately, is one of my least favorite words. It's too big. I don't know what that means. Every time I see a learning outcome with understand, I have unfortunately and very gently pushed back to try to get a little bit more information about what that might mean. And I'll ask that really fun question, what does that look like? So when we want our students to articulate understanding, when we want them to look back and to think ahead and to make connections, what are we asking them to do? And how can reflection help that? So often, this work of reflection is helping us to organize information, to translate. And when I say translate, my doctoral research was looking into tacit knowledge. So that sort of implicit knowledge that, I'm learning on this new job how most people dress and what work from home looks like and how folks typically share information, things that aren't necessarily documented or written down. And sometimes that means for students also translating to profession specific or topic specific knowledge. We also want them to be able to communicate that knowledge back. That's one way to check for understanding. And maybe it also means demonstrating, whether that's a particular skill or demonstrating again, there's some level of awareness of what we're trying to teach. So reflection might be then, for example, asking them to write a journal entry, thinking about an experience that they had, but not just reporting on what happened. That is certainly part of it. It actually is really interesting data as you work through a SoTL project to see what students do and don't recognize as important from a learning experience. If you've done something where you thought the group work was going to be super exciting, but nobody mentions it and everybody talks about the Kahoot game that was played at the end of the activity, that's really important data. So the looking back is not less important. All it means is it's foundational information for students to then take to organize, translate, communicate, and demonstrate. And there are usually questions that you can ask. I'm always happy to chat through questions. Asking good and better questions is honestly 85% of a lot of SoTL projects, learning to ask good and better questions. those questions can help you pull some of that data or information. Then we move into, so I'm back on the left side of the table. I'm in that middle row, showcase learning, demonstrating process alongside product. This is where I will be honest, some of the most interesting conversations with a lot of colleagues, both who were engaging in teaching activities, but also those who were developing SoTL projects, recognizing that we often only see the product of a learning experience and not the process of student learning. Now, there are lots of things in there. Well, of course, we can't see all of it, and we'll never know all of it. And perhaps that's true, particularly when we're asking students to reflect and report back. We're not mind readers, even though we may or may not want to be. But we can look into what's the process of student learning? How did we get here? And how do students think that we got here? So, to overuse the transportation metaphors that I use a lot, we may put together this beautiful boat ride for students. It's this many-story ferry. I lived in Victoria for a little while, so I'm thinking back to going back and forth between Vancouver and Victoria. I'm sitting on the boat. I know there's access to really good ferry ice cream and beautiful views. And all the students are talking about is how choppy the water was. No interest in the ice cream, weird. No interest in the ferry ride, other than water was really choppy. I didn't even think we'd get here. Meanwhile, I'm at the front of the ship steering, thinking everything's fine. So that idea of process is where a lot of this reflection can be useful in SoTL projects. How do we get students to articulate and, in fact, even showcase this is what it took for me to get here? This is what I understood you were going to do. This is what I thought was happening. Or when you asked me to do something, some of my favorite reflection questions are, what did you do first? Why did you do that first? And what did you do next? And then why did you do that? It's a lot of what and why, sort of the early stages of reflection questions. But using reflection to be metacognitive, to show that bridge that we talked about earlier, that is a really intriguing way to investigate student learning. And again, I don't mean investigate from a place of, why did you do that? Why did you not do that? To be prescriptive or evaluative, but to be curious, which is what a lot of SoTL research is. How can we be curious about what it took for our students to get here? And how do we know? And then finally, documenting evidence. So a lot of reflection, we do usually offer students the opportunity to write and to share. Often, and especially in early stages of reflective practice, reflection is primarily a written exercise. So this is where we collect evidence. Some folks will call it data of how, what, when, and if students are learning. So I'm just looking at the bottom part of that table right now. I will offer that writing is often an easy approach. It's not always the most accessible approach when it comes to reflection. So I've had really great success. A couple folks used to know me as the Lego lady, which was nice, I think. I would walk around literally with like tote bags full of Lego building blocks, and have folks build out structures as a way to demonstrate what they were thinking and to use that as a different medium to share their process as well as their product. I've had people draw. I've had folks find an image online that represents their experience and talk about it. I've used lots of different things because learning happens in lots of different ways. So I wanted to be clear that when I talk about evidence, you may see a little bit of it creep in for me around reflective writing because that's what I'm used to, and that's often what I facilitate. But again, it's not the only, nor is it the most accessible way to engage with students and offer that kind of reflection. But the goal, honestly, here is we want to pull out some of this process and we want something to refer to and something that students have communicated to begin that dialogue. So if they continue to reflect and it stays up here, it may very well be useful for them, but it may not be as meaningful for us. So what are the ways, again, whether that's a journal entry, a 1 minute paper, which is exactly what it sounds. I'm going to give you a question and give you a minute to write down some early thoughts. draw me something. I do objects a lot of the time. So, what does this pen have to do with the experience, for example? But how do we find ways for students to think about what they did, talk about what they did, show you evidence that they are engaged in a learning process, ideally, show you evidence that they are learning? And of course, we can trouble what that definition of learning might mean, depending on your goals and outcomes, but also that there is a way for you to collect some level of evidence or data to make data informed decisions through your SoTL project, through your teaching activities, a way that you can use this information to inform future thought. And often that future thought comes with the third big question in reflection, which is now what? Where do we go from here? So you've had more than enough of me telling you the what and the so what. So I wanted to offer at this point in the presentation a few minutes of reflection, but also if you happen to use this time to get up, stretch, get a coffee, go to the bathroom, I won't know. So it's all good if you want to use that time as well. But here's what we're going to do for the rest of our time together. You'll see three questions on my slide. Those three questions are ones that I have thought about and have offered in one form or another to folks who are thinking about a SoTL project or even just a way to think about student learning, to think about something related to teaching and learning that is important to them. And how do we start answering, that big question, what does that look like? So in just a moment, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes or so to think about these three questions. The first question is, what's one thing you regularly do in class where you'd like to know how students are responding? So as an example, for me, I do a lot of think, pair, share or similar activities. So think, pair, share would be think would be they're thinking on their own. Then I put them in pairs to have a quick discussion, and then I do a large group discussion. As a facilitator and as a teacher, I tend to do that a lot. I want folks to engage. So that's something I'm always curious about. I enjoy that as a facilitator. Does that mean my students are getting something out of it? Question two, what feedback would tell you this strategy is working or not for your students? That might be, in my case, students saying, I'm so tired of talking to other people, Lisa. Like, I need more time to think before I do the pair and the share. Or maybe there's a particular topic that I need to see if they're actually able to identify, describe, discuss that topic that I'm using Think, Pair, Share as a teaching strategy for. So feedback could be, do you like what I'm doing? And can you mirror back to me the topic that I'm trying to teach you? Those might be two areas of feedback for me. And the last question is, how can students share this feedback with you? So for me, that might be an anonymous poll in my learning management system. Hey, folks, I just tried something new in the class today. Let me know what you think. And of course, I'd probably articulate that with some sub questions, but that's really what I want to know. What do you think? So I'm going to give you 10 minutes. What's one thing you regularly do in class where you'd like to know how students are responding? What feedback would tell you the strategy is working or not for your students? And how can students share this feedback with you? So I'm going to call it, because math was never my strong suit, I have, for my time in the Eastern time zone, 1:39 p.m. So I'm going to come back at 1:50 p.m., 10 minutes from my time. What I'll do at that time is I'll verbally let you know that we've come back together. The goal for taking this up is I'm going to ask, hopefully, a brave or willing soul to share some of what they've been thinking about, and we'll muddle our way through that together as a little bit of a case study exercise. We'll do some take up with that. I've got at least one more slide to wrap that up, but I would like to hear from all of you. And you can respond to me verbally or in the chat when we do that. So it's just turned over to 1:40, which was exactly what I was hoping to do. So 1:40 p.m. by my clock, I will verbally bring you back together at 1:50. Feel free to turn your camera off, turn your mic off for this 10 minutes, and I'll verbally call you back together in 10. And if you have any questions, I'll be here and I'll be taking a look at the chat. Thanks, everyone. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your engagement and your reflection. Now that we are back together, as I mentioned before, I'm curious if we have someone who is willing to share their response. We'll start with number one. So, their response to the question number one. What's one thing you regularly do in class where you'd like to know how students are responding? Feel free to turn your microphone on and share that with me verbally. I'm also taking a quick look at the chat as well. And I think, actually, if I'm reading this right, I have the good problem of lots of good engagement in the chat. So, thank you, everyone. I'm just going to read out in the chat what I have from Sandy. I have taught primarily first generation, first gen students and have struggled with getting them to become comfortable working in groups. So I often can't determine whether it's the activity itself or the idea of participating in a group that hinders or helps learning. Just for the record, Sandy, that is an excellent research question. And in the free time that I know you have, that's also a dissertation topic. That is amazing. And I love that you're articulating that in a way that speaks to the experience as well as the experiential component. So thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, and Sandy, this can be for you, but not to put you on the spot. This can be for other folks as well. Let's move into question two. From what I'm reading, my interpretation is it's hard to determine if it's the activity of working in a group or the idea of just participating in a group that helps or hinders learning. What feedback would tell Sandy this strategy is working or not for students? And Sandy, if you'd like to jump in, please feel free. You can keep typing in the chat, but I also wanted to open that up to others as well. What feedback might be useful to know if it's the activity or just the idea of participating in a group? Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I would typically just ask them what worked and what didn't work
Mm.
after an activity, and sometimes we'll generate rules and stuff like that,
Oh, yeah.
after the fact, as to how to make it better. So I would just feel it back to them that way. I guess if some people didn't want to speak up, they could write it down on a piece of paper and submit it anonymously or something.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah, thanks,
a
Andrew.
little first thought to get things going.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Right.
a good first thought. And I
Okay,
promise
great.
I didn't pay Andrew ahead of time to be like, can
Yeah.
you say something? No, that was excellent. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay,
You've
thanks,
cut on
thanks.
you've hit on a couple of different things. So one is this idea of what worked, what didn't is actually really a good starting point for a lot of reflective questions. And we can build on that. So Sandy could think about what worked in terms of the instructions that I gave you. Were they clear enough? Did they tell you what I wanted? Did they set the expectation? Do you know why we're doing this activity? And then what didn't work? Did you feel like you had enough time to do the group activity, which is a huge one in classes, right? This notion of time. And there were a few questions, excuse me, and comments in the chat about that. So, Andrew, you're right. This idea of feedback on what worked, what didn't makes a lot of sense to me. And now we're expanding that out to getting them to reflect and reflect back on the experience, look back. What was I doing? What did I know or not know? And think ahead. If Sandy was going to do that activity again, how would they do that differently? And how can students share the feedback with you? Andrew, you mentioned that too. Could be a survey. Maybe it's an anonymous survey to ideally make it a little bit more accessible to students who do often feel challenged by giving feedback directly to an instructor for lots of reasons. So maybe it is a survey with a few questions. Maybe it is just in time or formative feedback right after that particular activity. Maybe it is, again, if there's a particular topic that Sandy's teaching, maybe there's a way to sort of quiz. I don't always like that word, but to get at some of the learning a little bit more. Sandy, I've said your name a few times and we're talking about you like you're not here, and I'm very aware that you are. So, Sandy, if there's anything else you wanted to add to this discussion before we move on, please let me know. Perfect. Thank you, Sandy. You read my mind. So, I'm just going to read what Sandy has in the chat. I usually use concept mapping in the public policy research course, and they do this as a group. One semester, I had the time to do this activity both as a group activity and as an individual activity. That's a really interesting way to compare that. Although students did better when they worked in a group in the evals, they all prefer to work individually. So I think part of the experiential learning should have been a quick activity at the beginning on how, excuse me, the beginning of the course on how to work in a group. For example, LTAs, engagement issues. This is a SoTL paper that we're seeing happen in real time in this chat, which is amazing. And thank you, Sandy, for being willing to share your experience with us. I don't take that lightly that you've given us something really important to play with today. So thank you. And that in and of itself is really interesting for students to reflect on. They did better when they worked in a group. And Sandy, I'm going to take that to mean in terms of like grading and the outcomes that you had. But in the evaluations, they're reflecting to you that they preferred to work individually. So where might that gap be? What connections can we make? And what other types of reflection can we offer our students to help them think about why that might be the case, whether that's reflecting on their own learning style, reflecting on how the group activity is set up, some combination of those things, or other ideas as well. Thank you, everyone. Only in the interest of time, I wanted to make sure that I showed you this slide. Ooh, Matthew, that's such a good article, and I bet you know why I think that's such a good article, because we've used this article together a few times. I did want to highlight the article that Matthew put in the chat, measuring actual learning versus the feeling of learning. That idea of, do I feel like I learned something versus the learning I actually did, is one of the challenges and opportunities in experiential learning. Thanks for sharing that, Matthew. So what you saw in my slides is I was labeling them what, so what, now what. What, so what, and now what is a model for critical reflection that, again, you've got the reference on the bottom of the slide, is one that we use again to think about the process, not just the product of critical reflection. So the what happened, so what, why does it matter, and now what will you do differently? And I don't know if this is like a big reveal, but that is what I was trying to do in the slides today. What is critical reflection? Why is it important and how can we use it? And now what are some ways that we can apply it? So this is the model that I follow in my own work in reflection. This might be the model that you choose in thinking through that SoTL project. So let me just go here. So thank you. Fast and furious hour on experiential learning, but I wanted to point to a couple of things that may be helpful. As I've mentioned, you'll have a copy of these slides and my references, as well as a few other resources. There are some, actually lots of really good resources, but I'll point you to some that inform sort of my broader thinking on experiential learning for you to use in a way that you might see fit. On the bottom left of the slide, you'll see my contact information. Please don't hesitate to email me. What did you mean by this? I can't open the article that you sent, any of those things. I am certainly open to those questions. And connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I've been reigniting some really interesting and important engagement opportunities on LinkedIn, so I'm happy to connect there. There was some conversation about this in the chat. Being an educational developer, I love teaching and learning centers. I'm a big fan of teaching and learning centers. So please make sure you visit your teaching and learning center. They do good work. And I'm not just saying that because I know them and I love them. It's because I know they do good work. So please do connect with them. A lot of the questions that you have and that you will continue to have, there are folks there that can answer them for you. So certainly reach out to me, but you've got some fantastic experts right at your fingertips. So please take advantage of that exciting opportunity. And we've got, I would say, yeah, about 2 minutes or so. So maybe you can finish the sentence stem for me in the chat. Something I'm still wondering about is if maybe there's a question top of mind. But I can stick around if folks have questions as well. But I will just say, I know it's a busy day and it's a Monday and it's 1:59 by my clock. So Tommy, was there anything else that you wanted to make sure you shared, just so I'm not talking through to about, 2:30, 3 o'clock over here?
Just to thank you so much on behalf of not just the center here at Yorkville University and Toronto Film School, but on behalf of all our faculty and instructors as well. We've heard, my team here has heard in many different circles and conversations about the experiential learning that exists, that we think exists, that we want to exist differently and more powerfully in our courses. So there are many folks who had regrets that they couldn't make it to the live session and are eager for the recording. So thank you so much, Dr. Lisa, for joining us and for taking us through this incredible work across your career career and that you continue going on so strongly with as a national leader.
Oh, thanks so much, Tommy. And Dr. Lisa, still after all this time, like, who are you talking about? I defended in 2020, and every time I hear Dr. Lisa, I'm almost like, who is that? But it's nice to have that validation. So for those of you going through it, trust me, one day you'll hear Doctor your name here too. It'll happen. Thank you, everyone. It's 2 o'clock by my clock, so if you need to run, please do. I won't take offense, but I'll also stick around for a couple of minutes if folks have any questions. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and thanks so much. This was fun.
Thanks very much. Thank you.